Good evening here in our premises of the International Institute for Peace, and good evening all those who are online watching us now or perhaps later when they look at the recorded event. On behalf of the OIIP, I want to welcome you here, but also of course mention our partners, OIIP, the Rennes-Institute and the Balkan Forum, and we're very grateful to our partners for supporting and organizing this event with us together. In the afternoon, we already had a very intensive discussion about the subject. And the subject is, of course, how to counter the authoritarian rules we have inside the EU, but also outside, especially also in the Western Balkans. Two elections of last Sunday, the Hungarian election and the election in Serbia of the president, the parliament, and also in Belgrade, were the immediate occasion we thought it would be good to think about authoritarian rule. It is so that, unfortunately, these authoritarian leaders and parties have been re-elected quite strongly, at least in the Hungarian case, a bit less strongly maybe in Serbia. But of course, it's not only in these countries. In these two countries we notice the authoritarian rule. We also have it in Poland, and therefore we have, thank you very much, a guest from Poland who will also participate and make it very clear that we have to fight or join a common fight. And this is my last sentence, because that was the idea also, that we should not look from Western European or European Union side to the Balkans and say, you have to do something about the authoritarian tendencies and trends in your countries. No, it is a joint fight. And of course, we cannot just expect that the Balkans say, you, the EU, must do something. No, we have to do it together, especially civil society is asked to act against authoritarian rules in our countries, to fight for democracy, for transparency, for open societies. And that's the main message we want to spread from here. But how to do it and what are the specific possibilities and chances, this is of course the decision, is of course the subject of the discussion here. In the afternoon it was Stephanie, our director, who led the discussion. Now it's Marilia, our expert coming from Russia. So she knows what authoritarian rule is. She knows it quite well. As she said quite chokingly just a minute ago, we in Minsk are already very advanced in our authoritarian rules. Hopefully the others will not follow, because our idea is the contrary, that also authoritarian rules in Minsk and Moscow will at least be fought in time. Marilia, it's up to you now to take over.
Thank you very much, Hannes. Good evening to everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. And without further ado, I will just announce a few procedural remarks. We are missing one panelist, our Russia expert. He could not come, unfortunately, so we will have a discussion maybe on a bit more focused range of countries, but I'm sure that other speakers will be also able to reflect on the developments in Russia. We will discuss the elections result in Serbia, in Hungary, and then also talk about the Western Balkans region in general, and speak as well about Poland and the authoritarian tendencies there. So I will start with Vuk VELEBIT, who is a political analyst based in Belgrade, and I will ask you to reflect on the elections and your thoughts on what's going to happen next.
Thank you very much for having us and for gathering all of us here today. Regarding elections, yeah, it's much better. Regarding elections in Serbia, I would be very brief. So, according to the all public polls that were able before the elections, we could see that Vučić will get higher support presidential elections, also over 50% on parliament elections, which didn't happen. So it was lower result than everybody expected, and I would say that the biggest surprise of these elections are three right-wing parties who will be entering the parliament. So it's Serbian movement Dveri, Zavetnici, and Democratic Party of Serbia. So that is kind of change and something that was happening before the elections because of the Ukraine crisis and pro-Russian narratives, which are very, which dominated Serbian public before elections, but also generally speaking in Serbian media. So many parties tried to win some points in this Ukraine crisis because of the public, which is already has very strong pro-Russian sentiments. Also, Ukraine crisis changed the topics in elections, as we could not hear anything related to the campaign or like the programs of political parties. So all the attention was basically on what was happening in Ukraine. And also the results of the elections are a bit different than we expected. So the surprise also is that the Socialist Party of Serbia won 100,000 more votes than in the previous elections. And that is probably because they were trying to steal the votes from Serbian Progressive Party. As Serbian Progressive Party and Serbian President Vučić, he was trying to balance between West and East, so between Russia and US and the European Union. And now the main question basically is who will form the government. SNS, they do not have a majority. They won 44%, something around that. So they will need to form the government either with minority parties or with SPS. But it may happen that if the pressure which is coming from the West is that strong, it may happen that Vučić will not form, that his party won't form a government with SPS, which is considered as as basically Russian allies in Serbia, as members of SPS are controlling the energetic sector, which is which basically is owned by Serbia and by Russia. But if Vučić decides to go with without SPS, it might be a sign that Serbia will, in the coming months or in the coming period, will go more pro-Western course. And they just saw that Serbia again voted for UN resolution. This time it is a resolution on suspending Russia from Human Rights Council of United Nations because of violations of law and everything that is happening in Ukraine. So Serbia is more and more aligning with Western partners on these resolutions, and it may be expected that Serbia will impose some kind of sanctions over Russia. So in that case, if that happens, Vučić will try to gain support from the West. So it will be even more harder for Serbian opposition to take a clear stand on this issue and to try to present to the West as reliable partner instead of Vučić. So that is something that we will probably be witnessing in the upcoming period. And I'll finish with Belgrade elections. It is still not clear who will form the local government. Some elections might be repeated on some polling stations, So it is still a question, will the current opposition form the government or the ruling party?
Thank you very much, Vuk, for being brief. Maybe just one follow-up question to you very shortly. You described this potential balancing act of Alexander Vučić in case he would need to become more pro-Western in his approach. So what does the West, what should the West do actually if he indeed reaches out to them? How can they deal with him? Should they cooperate with him? Should they support him? Should they make some conditions? What's your take?
Well, I think, they support him for last 10 years, basically, as he presents himself as the most reliable partner. And before elections, Vučić had talks with Quinta members, so it's states like US, France, Italy, and United Kingdom. So he already said that he is under very strong pressure from the West. What I've heard in Belgrade is that Western partners gave to Vučić kind of grace period until the elections are over, so he didn't have to impose any kind of sanctions over Russia before the elections, because he knew that if he does that he will probably lose some support from his voters. So I think according to like all signs that we have in media, I think that it is expected that some sanctions will be imposed. And one additional note is that just last week, new U.S. Ambassador Christopher Hill has arrived to Belgrade. He is very well known in Serbian public as he was active during the 90s. He was right hand of Richard Holbrooke, who was the chief negotiator of U.S. and during the crisis in Bosnia. So they were together making they were working on Dayton Agreement and on peace talks. So Chris Hill is he knows the Balkans region, and he said that he's coming to Belgrade with new US approach towards Balkans and towards Serbia. He said that he's not going to look to the past but to the future. So I think that Americans will be playing a more active role than it was the case, and it was kind of strange that they withdrew the previous ambassador almost 2 years before his mandate was over, and they called Christopher Hill, who was retired, to come to Belgrade. So those are a bit strange signs, because we do not know, or even like in diplomatic circles, people do not know what exactly is the new US approach. What is their plan? Are they planning to solve the Kosovo issue or something else? Or, regarding our topic here, how to deal with authoritarian trends, Christopher Hill, in the hearing in the US Senate, he said that America must take new approach, and that US, that they will need to offer to the Serbia something that is better and popular than Serbia is getting from Russia and China.
Thank you. I will turn now to Zsuzsanna VÉGH, who is a research fellow at European University Viadrina in Frankfurt. And Zsuzsanna will tell us more a bit the past elections in Hungary that also took place on the same day as the elections in Serbia, and in some way also brought a very similar outcome, also an expected outcome. So Zsuzsanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Well, I think we have much less question marks in Hungary with regards to who is going to form the next government, unlike in Serbia. but the results were nonetheless somewhat surprising. Before the elections, most polls were suggesting that there is going to be somewhat of a tighter race, at least when it comes to the popular vote. And some even suggested that maybe the opposition, the united opposition of 6 parties, has a chance to defeat the ruling Fidesz. Quite the contrary happened. Instead of defeating Fidesz in these elections, the opposition lost quite spectacularly, and Fidesz managed to win the 4th consecutive election, again with a 2/3 majority, and what's more, it has delivered its strongest result to date. We are still not having the very final results. Some of the votes, part of the mail-in ballots and votes casted in Hungary's representations, mostly in Western Europe or in the West, are still to be counted. So we will probably have final results by the end of this week. But we already see that Fidesz has not just a 2/3, but a very comfortable 2/3 majority. An additional surprise this time around was the entrance of the Our Homeland movement, a new extreme right party to the government that was formed pretty much after the 2018 elections from the extremist members of the former radical right Jobbik. So Our Homeland movement entered the parliament now for the first time with 7.5%, landing it, as we see now, 7 mandates. So if we add up what Fidesz and Our Homeland movement has at the moment, we are over 140 seats out of the 199 in the parliament that is essentially captured by far-right parties, extreme right and radical right party. So apart from the surprises at the polls, this election was also quite historic for 2 reasons. I mentioned that the opposition parties ran together, and this is the first time that 6 opposition parties joined together in order to avoid the fragmentation of the opposition vote and have a better chance to win in single mandate districts, which in Hungary's electoral system are essentially the ones that decide the final outcome of the elections, that decide who will be able to form a government, considering that their proportion is higher in the mandates overall. It was also historical for the reason that this was the first time that a full-scale OSCE ODIHR mission was sent to Hungary and also to an EU member state, which was based on the fact that the 2014 and 18 elections were already considered free but not fair by ODIHR, and also due to the observation that in the 2018 and 19 local elections there have been election day irregularities also observed. So this time around, Hungary had a very closely watched election, and we are still waiting for the final report from the ODIHR mission. But as the preliminary assessment suggests, most likely there were no systemic irregularities on election day, which means that the uneven playing field that has already been observed in previous elections too was really the real reason why Fidesz had a comfortable majority yet again. That plus a strategy by the opposition that apparently did not bring the results that the 6 parties were hoping for. What we observed is that 4 years ago, these 6 opposition parties actually managed to gather 2.7 million votes altogether on the national lists. This time around, they managed to gather 1.8. So significantly less, this is 900,000 votes less for these parties, which means that the radical right voters most likely voted for the extreme right instead of the joint opposition. Partly also for Fidesz, joint opposition. Partly also for Fidesz or stay at home. So what follows? I think here what is useful to consider is the experience we have with Fidesz over the past by now 12 years. We have seen that after its electoral victories, Fidesz has never moderated. It has never moderated either in terms of its approach to democratic institutions nor in its ideological track. Since 2010, when Fidesz was elected first with a 2/3 majority into the Hungarian parliament, we have observed executive aggrandizement, whereby an elected government systematically undermined democratic institutions as well as democratic values. It dismantled checks and balances in the system. Over the past 12 years, this means that it landed Hungary from the status of a consolidated democracy to what we can call as a hybrid regime in current day. This means that by today, all state institutions, all power branches are essentially under the control of the Fidesz party. I also mentioned that Fidesz did not moderate in terms of its ideology. Instead, over the past 12 years, and especially since 2015, it has gradually radicalized. From what was once a mainstream right-wing party, Fidesz now is, I would say, a radical right party in terms of its ideology. It has adopted many of the elements of the former radical right Jobbik's program and has shifted into a nativist, xenophobic, authoritarian party. With the extreme right now in the parliament on its own right, I would not expect that this sort of ideological radicalization would stop. In fact, what we see also on the European level after Fidesz has left the European People's Party is that it's seeking allies among far-right parties in the European Parliament and more broadly within Europe. So I think that sort of radicalization is definitely in the cards. We do not see any sign that there would be a U-turn in the Fidesz parties and the upcoming government's domestic policy. I also don't think that there is going to be a particularly strong shift in the foreign policy of the upcoming Fidesz government. It has been pursuing a balancing act between its allies in the West and Russia and China more broadly over the past several years, and it has also continued that track since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. So what I expect in this regard is that Fidesz is going to deliver the minimum as long as its red lines are not crossed towards the Western allies. The red lines have been made very clear. It's anything, any sanction that would affect energy, the import of gas, oil, and the nuclear sector. So as long as that's not touched, Fidesz is most likely going to deliver the minimum. It's not going to seek to regain the broken trust of the Western allies that we, by today, definitely can observe. And it is going to do its utmost to maintain friendly relations with Russia, even despite and in the context of the war. I think a very telling sign for this is how, or what were the opponents Victor Orban has listed, he has defeated in these elections, and among his usual scapegoats, the international left, the domestic left, Brussels bureaucrats, NGOs, Soros. Now we also see President Zelensky being added to the opponents. In fact, Orban and Szijjártó were claiming that Zelensky is interfering in the Hungarian election campaign, but somehow they left unaddressed the fact that over the past several years, the Hungarian Foreign Ministry's IT system has been hacked by Russia repeatedly and continuously, also exposing Western allies to that sort of essentially threat from Russia's side. So I think this is pretty much the current picture, and overall I think we'll see a continuation of the trends that we have observed over the past decade.
Thank you. What I found very interesting actually in our discussions during the day is this split that you mentioned between Budapest and the rest of the country, and that observers also probably coming from Budapest, when they went to observe elections in other municipalities, they were surprised that people actually are voting for Fidesz and the other right-wing party. So can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Why? What are the reasons for this very clear split, and whether something is being done to overcome it, at least from the side of those who are in the opposition?
Indeed, the electoral results have shown that the united opposition has a strong support in Budapest. It won most of the single mandate districts in Budapest. But if we look at the map of Hungary, then we see that the country outside of the capital is essentially, with the exception of a few districts, is entirely orange. There has been an initiative this year by several organizations, among them 20K and Unhacked Democracy, who sought to ensure that there are also going to be delegates from opposition parties in the individual polling station committees to ensure the integrity of the elections. Previously, this was a challenge. Opposition parties don't have such a strong rooting in let's say the countryside, as opposed to Fidesz. There may have been a suspicion that in the countryside there is also election day rigging. These, not observers, because there is no civil observation allowed in Hungary, these delegates to the local committees in their recounts of how election day proceedings went, mostly noted that they did not really see irregularities on election day, but indeed they were very surprised that the local communities are voting for Fidesz. And for this I would propose two explanations. One is the fact that the opposition is not properly embedded in the countryside. It's not properly embedded in localities across the country. It doesn't have the type of network that Fidesz has very consciously built up, not over the past 10 years, but over the past 20 years. The opposition parties did not manage to do this. This also means that their campaign was much less visible outside of Budapest, and the messages they were putting forward in the campaign were much more targeted to a Budapest audience rather than a countryside audience. So that would be one side of the coin. The other side of the story is that Hungarian media is strongly pro-government and government-controlled. When it comes to public media, there is political influence, and public media is what reaches society to the widest. And there is a significant concentration and dominance of pro-government outlets under the oversight of the Central European Press and Media Foundation, KESMA, which oversees over 500 outlets across the country, including local press. The independent outlets cannot compete, neither with the volume nor with the finances behind these outlets. So I think these two factors, the lack of opposition presence and the media landscape, heavily distorts the playing field and tilts it towards the governing parties.
Thank you. I will now turn to another EU country, Poland, and will ask Maciej KISILOWSKI, who is Associate Professor of Law and Strategy at Central European University, to talk a little bit about authoritarian tendencies in Poland. We know that there have been many developments in recent years, including problems with minority rights, independence of judiciary. Just in November last year, Polish Constitutional Court declared that the European Convention of Human Rights was incompatible with Polish constitution. So, considering that Poland is an EU member state, it's a very surprising, I would say, to put it mildly, surprising judgment. But at the same time, the peculiarity is that Poland, unlike Serbia and Hungary, has a very different type of relationship with Russia. So how does it all play together? Maciej, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Just one point of correction. I would not call the body that has declared the European Convention of Human Rights our constitutional tribunal, maybe so-called constitutional tribunal. Now, on the difference between Poland and Hungary. So let me start by pointing out the major difference, and it's very easy given the excellent summary of the Hungarian situation, but by Mrs. VÉGH. So the virus of authoritarianism in both countries comes to a patient with pre-existing conditions. However, I would argue that the available data shows that those pre-existing conditions are much stronger in Hungary than in Poland. The measure that was already introduced by Mrs. VÉGH, which is very helpful to kind of count not only the ruling right-wing regime, the electoral support of the ruling right-wing regime, but also other right-wing parties that are kind of not representing the EU direction and perspective. I think this is a very useful measure. By that measure, since 2010, Hungarian voters in 3 consecutive elections, so not a protest vote, not a temporary swing, but a long-term trend in 2010, 14, and 18, gave the support of nearly 70%, that's 70%, to those anti-European parties. At that time, it was Fidesz and Jobbik. The same measure in Poland, by the way, a good news, one of the rare good news about this measure is that if you assume that the part of Jobbik that was folded into the united opposition was kind of transformed a little bit, and that's a big if, that measure of like anti-EU values inconsistent with the EU gets significantly better to about 60% in the last Sunday's election, which is the Fidesz and the new fascist party. However, the same measure in Poland, if you take all anti-European parties together, the highest point, the really highest point, not the floor, but the ceiling of support for those parties in Poland over the last 20 years was not 70%, was 51%. And that was the result in 2015. And this was also happened to be the result For Mr. Duda, we have a popularly elected president with a French-type runoff. So we have this additional measure for this support that our Hungarian colleagues don't have. And Mr. Duda, both in 2015 and 2020, got just this 51%. So, you know, in all fairness to Hungarian opposition, it's quite difficult job to take a majority of a country which for more than a decade had, you know, 70% support for anti-EU forces. I think Polish opposition is in much better starting position because it's much more of a 50-50 situation. So by that measure, I would say Hungary is much more like Russia and Poland is much more like Turkey, broadly speaking. Of course, those comparisons always miss a lot of dimensions. But in terms of a very closely divided society, I don't think, well, a lot of my progressive colleagues from CEU who are Hungarian hope to call the Hungarian society closely divided. You know, I don't think that unfortunately this is the case, but in Poland it is the case. And election after election shows that both camps are very even, which also explains why the tactics of the autocrats are different. They can't afford to change the constitution, so they need to capture the courts, make a mockery of constitutional court, as I mentioned at the outset. Now, so this is an important difference in context because a lot of people compare it kind of like apple to apple, and 20 percentage points for any student or practitioner of politics is a world of difference. Now to the similarities, and I actually think that the response to the to Putin's aggression to Ukraine is much more similar than your question would suggest, and that the conventional wisdom wants us to believe, because you know, first of all, both responses are rooted in a visceral, in-depth and committed anti-Westernism. Yes, so the idea of portraying the West as you know, a bunch of hypocrites who do not really care about countries such as Poland, Hungary, or for that matter Ukraine, and creating this vision of us being alone. Yes, and if we are alone as a society, then the only instinct, especially during wartime, is to turn to the government. Yes, because if we don't have any friends, if everybody is you know, in Putin's pocket, or at least doesn't care about us because of self-interest, who can protect us? Well, the government can protect us. Yes, and so in this sense, both governments have a same on the descriptive part, that their diagnosis is more similar than many people would want to believe. The prescription is different and maybe adjusted to the needs and the character of each respective society. Yes, I mean, Victor Orban tells his voters, if nobody cares, why should we? And Jarosław Kaczynski tells his voters that if nobody cares, Poland will once again adopt the role of the Messiah. Yes, and the Polish Messiah syndrome kicks in, and the idea that we will be the only moral one, we are the only one who truly care about Ukraine. But note how both responses are very inward oriented, very hostile to the very values that the brave Ukrainians are, you know, giving their lives for. Yes, the Western values, and that's why there is no narrative discord between being at the forefront of supporting Ukraine and invalidating European Convention of Human Rights, because the European Convention of Human Rights represents the hypocritical, self-interested, cynical West, and the strategy works. The strategy works because you have, for two reasons. First of all, the opposition is in a very difficult situation, what to respond to that message, yes? And the opposition tries to outdo the government in being even more, hawkish on Russia, but it's very difficult because Jarosław Kaczynski established his competitive advantage on this front. And the second reason why this is difficult is the behavior of the West. Yes, it is very clear that Polish government gets a lot of attention, high-profile photo ops, which are used by the state media, above all with the Joe Biden visit, but also Kamala Harris before that. So it's very difficult to say or to argue that Poland is isolated for its behavior. Yes, it looks like it's paying off to basically make this argument that the entire West was wrong and Poland is the only country that's right, which again is similar to what Orban is doing. The final similarity is the leverage. Yes, the leverage, it may look very different, but the leverage of being just within the EU sanctions and constantly, toying with the idea that we can veto next round of sanctions, and the leverage of being, the absolute, front runner in supporting Ukraine, it works in a similar way. It gives those authoritarian leaders a lot of room for maneuver from the West. I want to just make a final point, which is that there is also reality. Yes, there is political messaging, there is political strategy, which is quite smart, I must say, but there is also reality, and the reality is that this conflict should be the moment where we all recognize a complete fiasco of authoritarian policies of both Orban and Kaczynski. Just a few months ago, those leaders were meeting with some of the most pro-Russian far-right leaders, including Marine Le Pen, who knows, maybe will be a next president of France. Both leaders spent years, in Orban's case, decade, undermining European values and Western values, both with their actions and their rhetoric. They were quite open about their hostility to Western values all along. Nothing was hidden in a particularly subtle way, and if anything, the conflict in Ukraine, the war of Ukraine, is about a nation that wants to pursue the Western path. So, of course, rationally, this should be the complete end and humiliation of this kind of illiberal democracy nonsense, which is not a democracy at all. But because people are scared at times of war and they rally around the flag, and because the West has not been forceful enough to understand that you shouldn't support bad agents, even when you face an emergency, and even if you face an even worse agent, you still shouldn't prop up bad agents and the Trojan horses in your midst. For those two reasons, the strategy is working, and we may very well see early election that will put Mr. Kaczynski, like Mr. Orban, in power until 2026. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I have one follow-up question, but if you answer, please answer very shortly, maybe in a couple of words. So you already explained this logic, how the Polish government basically explains its position on Ukraine, and at the same time it's not for them in contradiction on their stance inside the EU. But let me ask you about Belarus, because the conflict in Belarus is purely about authoritarianism, and majority of Belarusian opposition are now actually based, who fled the country, are based in Poland. So, and the government also supports them. So, how is that explained if they're, themselves authoritarian from how we see it here? Maybe how do they see it? They do not support authoritarianism in Belarus, but they are themselves taking this path in a way.
Yeah, so nationalist authoritarians happen to fight with other nationalist authoritarians. That's what makes them, well, actually even nominally internationalist communist authoritarians fought each other. Think about China and Soviet Union. So yeah, so it is entirely possible that two nationalist authoritarian regimes would not like each other and would fight with each other, and that's what happens between Belarus and Poland.
Thank you very much. And I will turn now to Vedran DZIHIC, senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. And I'd ask him to comment on the elections, on the Western Balkans in general, maybe on Russia, on everything that's been discussed before.
Okay, thanks a lot. A kind of a broad question. So basically, I can do whatever I want. Huh? Okay, thanks a lot. I mean, for a few remarks, but the first one is something for the Austrian audience. I mean, it's very important that we discuss this topic: how to face the threat of authoritarianism, what to do. But what we hear when we look at the Austrian politics and what we have been hearing so far is a very loud silence on basically both in conceptual terms, but also in terms how to design a very, not pragmatic, but a very strong stance towards what's happening in the neighborhood, what's happening in the Western Balkans, beyond pragmatism, stabilitocracy, and empty phrases. But the Austrian foreign policy, unfortunately, has been producing so far over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I just remember, this is always funny, the barbecue session of Vučić and Sebastian Kurz. Now Kurz has left, he's now having barbecue with someone else in the Silicon Valley, probably. But I mean, that tells a lot. And speaking about Austria, the recent results of the Variations in Democracy 2022 report downgraded Austria to electoral democracy, not a liberal democracy anymore, which is quite significant. My point is we have to create a we have to create a discussion in Austria on foreign policy in times that are dramatic. And now I come to my 5 short points. Why are the times dramatic? I mean, analyzing elections, zooming into countries and settings, that's a very important exercise. But what I see on a bigger horizon is a major dramatic shift that's probably together with 1989 and 1945 or 1918 is going to shake the world as we have known it dramatically. There is and the problem and the point is when we analyze what now happened in Hungary, in Poland, in Serbia, what is happening in those competitive authoritarian regimes, I'm a bit afraid that we still use the vocabulary and the analytical tools of this liberal world order post-1989 normative democratic liberal setting. We still, tend to believe that there will be a positive outcome, that there will be a certain path towards opposition rising again, taking over, etc., etc. And I'm not quite sure whether this is the relevant one. While we do that exercise, on the other hand side, other vocabulary, other narrative is produced that we probably cannot reach out with our vocabulary that we have. Anyway. There is this wonderful, Ivan Krastev is now all around in the media, and his wonderful booklet written with Stephen Holmes on what was the title? The Light That Failed. They took the title from Rudyard Kipling, from the British poet, who published 1890, was it, the poem with the same title, The Light That Failed. And he produced like 2 outcomes at the end. One outcome was a positive one for his mummy, happy end, and another one, the longer version, was one with a negative outcome. I think now taking this kind of metaphor of negative happy ending or positive positive happy ending or negative results, I think we have arrived in an era where we cannot expect a happy ending anymore. And why is this the case? I think this competitive authoritarianism pattern has produced a certain resistance and durability and strength that's now, with new results of Fidesz in Hungary and new results of Vučić in Serbia, has achieved a kind of a new level of stability. Why is it the case? First of all, when we analyze the elections, we assume that there is a certain, at least, even playing field, a certain type of competition, that there is a place to compete. And I would argue that in both these cases, there was no even playing field, that the virtue of manipulating the public, controlling the media scene, using the institutions, being straight to the point when it comes to use the repression, even if needed, that we have reached a level and a point of no return, basically. There is right now no return back to pre-2010 in Hungary, unfortunately. And when I was talking to my colleagues in Serbia the last few days, I don't think that the opposition is going to manage to change anything in the next course of the few years if something major doesn't happen. So this is this kind of a moment that makes me quite depressive, but it, in the end makes us all ask few questions. The first question is that I think is most important, and I alluded at that question with referring to Austria. The first question is really how the West and how the EU, or which West and which EU, is going to approach these authoritarian challenges in which way. I think it's quite obvious the stabilitocracy approach, the appeasement politics approach, I mean, that has utterly failed. But many in the European Union, for example, have not realized that. I include here Austria, and I mean, we haven't spoken about Croatia, we haven't spoken about Slovenia, for example, etc., etc. And here the point is that I mean, the puzzling question is how to find a strategy to take the food out of the monsters that we were feeding for quite some time. And the monsters, Fidesz monsters and Serbian Progressive Party's monsters, have grown too big now. And now the question is really how to approach it. And I think this is the moment where we have to engage in some deeper thinking, which is good that we do it here. And the first and foremost point has to be to protect, obviously, on a security level, what we have in certain regions that are endangered. And then now we come to Bosnia, to Georgia, to Moldova, to many countries on the margins, on the border between this world and the other world. I think here we need a security effort. But then the security effort is probably not going to produce a new narrative, it's not going to produce a new hope. And the question is what are the sources of hope, and who are the partners on the other side to approach them? The source of hope has to be a kind of a moment of reconstructing the narrative around fundamental values that we all share. I think the German Minister of Foreign Affairs is quite right when she argues that we need a foreign policy based on values and human rights. But this kind of a policy has to be spelled out and carried out by all member states of the European Union in a kind of a united front. I mean, this is the question how to do this one, and there will be a lot of moments just to check it. I mean, the first one will be now the sanctions against Russia in the case of Hungary. Okay, this is the one moment. The second moment will be in the neighborhood, in the enlargement policy, the case of Vučić, Dodik and the others, because I don't really believe, I mean, Vučić is a master of deception, of creating illusions, of sitting on 52 chairs at the same time. And I think he's going to continue that one. I don't think that he's going massively to impose sanctions on Russia. He's going to lean towards China. He's going to travel probably to Berlin and Paris and to say that he's a nice guy, etc., etc. But I think this will be the testing cases. This will be the testing cases of this kind of a new foreign policy based on values. If Europe retreats back to this kind of a mixture of pragmatism, stabilitocracy, saying or giving them the legitimacy that they don't have after elections, I think we are going to fail. I think we are going to see a new systemic competition where parts of Europe are going to be in the middle of it with turmoil, with even conflicts, etc., etc. This is why we need this kind of a security dimension. And one last remark, and this is probably something important when we speak about a possible systemic competition on a global level between authoritarian states and democratic states, then the question is, what are the ideological fundaments that we can find and how ideological are those on the other side? I mean, if we argue that the Western EU concept of human rights, democracy has a certain positive ideology behind it, an ideology of that all men are born equal, that all men and women have equal opportunities, that we want to protect them, that we need an international world order based on institutions, based on rules, etc., etc. This is one side of the story. If on the other hand side, listening to Putin's speech before he invaded Ukraine, or looking into Orban's speech after the victory, attacking Zelensky and the West and the leftists, if we have this kind of another ideological, ontological system of truth that is being established on the other side, the question is basically how to enter this ideological competition. This is not 2010 when Ivan Krastev was speaking about Putin's vegetarian authoritarianism. That was his phrase in 2011. Mild, la la la. I think we have turned to full meat authoritarianism. And this full meat authoritarianism changes the coordinates of the world that we have. The question is probably two questions: whether to go even stronger with this narrative of the West, which has reached certain limits, or to start making compromises which will probably bring us back to the status quo that we have right now. So, I mean, you see from my remarks that I don't see any way back to this business of usual of the last 2 or 3 decades, that I don't see a kind of positive outcome out of the simple wish that we want to have a kind of a continuation of our hopes that liberalism is going to prevail and democracy is going to prevail. I'm just very pessimistic right now, and I really do think that we need to re-engage on an entirely new level with a lot of alarmism, a lot of kind of efforts that have to be put into from all of us, I mean, from institutes, politicians, media, civil society, protest movements, and that we have to look for allies on both sides. Speaking about allies, we can pick up the issue of social movements, protest movements, independent and civic forces in all these countries.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and maybe it's interesting for me to clarify one question or one thought that you mentioned, because also during the day we brought up this idea of value-based foreign policy, and generally the idea that the EU was actually based on values. So you're saying on the one hand that we need a new vocabulary for the new times, and at the same time we need to be pragmatic, but also you mentioned that we need to have values in our foreign policy. So my question is, like, is it really a new approach? Is it really a new vocabulary to say that we are now going to base our foreign policy on values? Eastern neighborhood policy or southern neighborhood policy was always, had this idea of conditionality, and there was also a value aspect there. So do we need to rephrase it? Do we need to, how do we need to change it so it's clear it's a different kind of policy?
No, we need to set it up anew. I mean, this is precisely the problem. I mean, we always claimed, be it in the enlargement policy, be it in the Eastern European policy, we always claimed that we did foreign policy or democratization based on values. The practice was a very pragmatic one, looking for deals, accepting the rules placed on us by Erdogan's, Vucic's, Orban's, Kaczynski's, and all the others, and we were constantly in this compromising kind of a position. I mean, this is the position that we have in a debate now in Germany, change through trade. Through economic cooperation, through density. That is not going to happen in Russia. I mean, not going to happen in Russia with Putin. So basically, I mean, we were preaching I mean, all the priests usually do, but we have not been living up to what we were preaching all the time. And I think now it's the momentum, at least from my point of view, to start living up to what you preach. And if you say values, and if you see that someone on the other side, and I now need to place Orban on the other side, that someone on the other side is simply making a fool out of you, with all the capacity of resources, propaganda, manipulation, adjustments, chameleon-like policies, then the last consequence has to be to exclude Hungary from the European Union. I mean, that might happen in a few years. We have to discuss the exit of Hungary because we simply can't accept it. I mean, the same goes for the enlargement policy. When you have Serbia and Montenegro, now particularly Serbia being a frontrunner in the EU accession in terms of open chapters, and at the same time, according to variationist democracies, Serbia is among the 10 most autocratizing states worldwide in the last decade. Then just forget the value-based foreign policy. This is nothing. This is basically feeding the monster, continuing to feed the monster. And now, I mean, we will need a kind of a major U-turn when it comes to Serbia, a major U-turn, and we would simply need a kind of a new strategy that really lives up to what it preaches and promises.
Thank you very much. So now we will open the floor to questions, but I already have got a request from Vuk to ask the first question. Others, please raise your hands. Luca will give you the microphone to ask your questions.
So, Vedran, regarding what you said about values, if you could clarify, how do you see the correlation between values and interests when we talk about foreign policy? Do you think that it goes hand in hand, or it can go like that values can go against the interests, and what happens in that situation?
This is a very tough one. I mean, now we have this gas discussion. I mean, we have values, we have interests on the other hand side. But the point is, if you just accept that on the other side stands someone like Putin, who has simply reached a kind of a new level of ontological security in what he is doing, then probably it will be sooner or later that Putin himself is going to turn off the gas pipelines and ruin the interests. And we are still in the kind of a mood we have to check, because this is going to place a kind of a hardship on us. I think values, I mean, the last 2 decades or 3 decades was interests over values. Quite often. Now we have to come back to the moment where we put values and principles over interests, if the interests are endangering the values. I mean, it's not always that way. I mean, you can sometimes just have interests and values put together and played out together, but sometimes you cannot. Now, in the case of Russia, you cannot. That means, yes, it's going to put a hardship on the population. It's going to be social and economic consequences. We will need to do a kind of for all of us just to leave the comfortability of our lives to come back, or to enable a future that might resemble, at least to a certain degree, what we have lived through 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. These years are gone, I think.
Just one more. Imagine the situation that if Vučić imposes sanctions over Russia, in terms of Serbian foreign policy, even though we do not know clearly what Serbian foreign policy is, but if that happens, do you think that is putting interests ahead of values in case of Serbia?
In case of Serbia, it's quite tough, because I don't think that Vučić has particular values. I mean, he is really the master of chameleon-like political life, adjusting to whatever is needed. The only value is the power. Or the only value is for him basically to be named or placed among the biggest Serbs of all times. I mean, he mentioned in his speech, I mean, I am the one that has won the most votes in the history of Serbia. I mean, this is a case for a clinic, psychological treatment, and not for a politician. But even if he goes and imposes sanctions against Russia, some types of sanctions, I still do think that he will try to find ways to open or keep the channel to Russia open, first of all. And I think that he's going to massively invest into the relationship with China, including the free trade agreement in 22, including new investments, including bringing in corrosive capital, and doing everything to outplay and outsmart the West once again. Yeah.
I see Maciej has also raised his hand, but I will first ask Hannes Svoboda to pose his question, because he has questions to both Maciej and Vedran, right?
Yeah, to all of you. To Vedran, I would suggest that we have clarity about the expressions. Relationship between EU and EU, or internal in a relation between EU nations and Commission and Hungary or Poland is not foreign policy. Secondly, relation to Serbia is not foreign policy, it's enlargement policy. So I think it's a different thing. And thirdly, then, the relation to other countries is foreign policy. So if we speak about value orientation, it is of course different if you're in one community where you should stick to certain values because it's part of the constitution, or if Serbia wants to join the European Union, where it can demand it, or other countries. So I think we should not speak value-oriented foreign policy and take in all of it. Yeah, the values are the same, but you cannot enforce values on Hungary the same as you can in Qatar, whatever, because and also on Russia, we don't punish Russia because they have different values, because now they have a war. So again, this is a different thing, because rightly, Stefanie said already in the afternoon, okay, now we go to Qatar or to Saudi Arabia. Is it a different values? No, it's a different interest because we want to stop the war. So I think we should a bit differentiate that. My question would be to you two who were here from Hungary and Serbia about the cooperation between Vučić and Orban. Because we know that Orban has extended his media empire, Vučić is extended his media empire. Are they working together? Or who is looking into this kind of strange cooperation between, it's not strange, for these neighboring autocratic leaders? Of course, in the Vojvodina, they have that kind of political cooperation, but I think more about this corruption, the media dominance. How do you see this kind of cooperation? And to Professor Kozelinski, my question would be, because you mentioned this special anti-Western attitude in Poland, how do you see a cooperation strongly with the Baltic countries? Because at least concerning Russia and also the criticism on Germany and other countries is very strongly also in the Baltic countries. And how do you see that this is, everybody speaks now about EU is united. How can this kind of attitude make a bigger division into the EU than perhaps Hungary, because Hungary is more or less isolated concerning the Russia issue, but on the Russia issue concerning Poland and Baltic countries, there could be a stronger, united force. Do you see that this united front of the EU could be split because of that strong wording and position of Poland and especially the Baltic countries and maybe also Romania, because it's those countries who had bad experience in the past also with Russia who are the strongest united in their policy concerning Russia.
Maciej, let's start with you.
Okay. First of all, I just want to very briefly say that if everybody got depressed by VEDRAN's diagnosis, I just want to say that at least I don't think things are as bad. We had an ideological dominance of liberal values, the so-called end of history. That ended. Now we have Cold War 2.0 with the nationalist autocrats of various sorts. And as it happens when you are not in a fight for a long time, you need to relearn two things: how to win and how to lose. And I think what VEDRAN was basically describing could have been a conversation in 1960s, 1970s, probably also in Vienna, where everybody would predict that Soviets will overrun us in 5 years. And it didn't happen, and the democracy won that time. And I am very confident that democracy will win this time. But as in any fight, there will be wins and there will be losses. And we just need to take it as, with a little bit of a perspective. The fact that we are losing in some peripheral countries like Poland doesn't mean the democracy is ending. If we lose in France, then it's a big problem. We lost in US, but we managed to win 4 years later. So this is going to happen for decades, and we just need to build our emotional stamina not to connect two dots and create very long lines. Now, on the excellent question about Poland and the Baltic countries. So yes, there is a narrative synergy with them for obvious historical reasons, and that obviously supports the authoritarian regime in Poland because it lends credibility to that view. It almost looks like the Visegrad is now replaced by these 4, Poland plus the 3 Baltic countries, increasingly. So there are some governments, some non-Polish sounding names that give legitimacy on the state TV. So that's obviously a political windfall of sort for the Polish regime. And the second part of your question was really a prediction, as I heard it, and I think it's spot on, unfortunately, which is that the propping up of the bad Polish actors is going to create even bigger problems for the united Europe than it would help. That's why I've been quite public about arguing that this doesn't make sense it does not make sense to prop them up. You can praise the ordinary Polish, you can praise the Polish mayors who are from the opposition and who are actually doing all the work on the ground with the refugees, not Mr. Morawiecki or Mr. Kaczynski. But you don't need to provide political windfalls, unearned political windfalls to the bad actor. It doesn't, it's not the kind of prescription that VEDRAN was proposing to change everything, to create a new narrative. It's more like a surgical, bureaucratic suggestion. Yes, don't give unnecessary photo ops to bad actors, and things will improve significantly, because the risk that you emphasize in your question is very real.
So on the question regarding relations between Hungary and Serbia, I think without really going into the details of the bilateral relations here, the development of the ties with Serbia and also with other countries in the Western Balkans from the Hungarian side really illustrates to what extent Hungarian foreign policy under Foreign Minister Szijjártó lost any character of a value-based, value-driven foreign policy. And he says so explicitly. So the foreign policy towards the region is driven first and foremost by economic interests. And here I would also add that the economic interests of circles close to the governing party, in the case of Hungary. Those completely overshadow any other consideration. And the reason why this is increasingly problematic is that this type of approach is no longer a bilateral or even a regional concern, but it is creeping into the EU's enlargement policy as well through how the Hungarian Commissioner, Oliver Várhelyi, is conducting the policy towards the region. It is definitely not value-driven, and how the Hungarian government is increasingly pushing for EU enlargement with complete disregard for meeting the requirements of the enlargement process and the Copenhagen criteria. We don't even need to go far back, just this past few days. In a recent interview or declaration from Foreign Minister Szijjártó, he has called for the immediate accession of Serbia into the European Union and opening talks with Bosnia-Herzegovina. There is no value consideration. And if we cannot hold EU member states accountable based on the grounds of European values that are laid down in Article 2, then this is exactly what is going to happen. We don't even need to go as far as value-based foreign policy. We will lose our credibility in the neighborhood, in the enlargement countries and candidate countries, and we will not even have value-based enlargement policy because the proponents of the enlargement are no longer considering those important. And this is characteristic of how the country, Hungary, treats the region, but also characteristic of how it is putting aside any sort of value consideration with countries outside of the immediate neighborhood.
So I'll sum up what Hannes asked and what Mr. Kisilowski said about that is not important if we lose Poland or Czech Republic, but more important are France and some other countries, and that is in relation what Vedran was talking about. So when it comes to Vučić and Orban, their relation is important because at first autocrats support each other. Secondly, Orban projects influence and he is getting support for his policy, for his values, for his view on democracy. On the other side, Vučić is trying to get legitimacy for what he is doing in Serbia because he can easily say that the same things are happening within the EU. It's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Poland. And for that reason, it is important not to lose democratic values and democratic countries in Eastern Europe, because Serbia and other states in the region, we are not able to compare ourselves with France or with Netherlands, and we are not aiming to become France or Netherlands. We are, our aim, I mean, we can only compare to Eastern European countries and to the countries in the region. And our next step is to become like, I don't know, Poland or Czech Republic in terms of GDP, in terms of like things that were happening in the 90s when it comes to like institution building, etc. So for that reason, it is important to keep democracy and to keep liberal democratic values even in Eastern Europe. Because if it's lost there, then it will be very hard to achieve them in the Balkans.
Thank you very much. Vedran, you have a comment. Are there any pressing questions from the audience apart from the comment from Vedran? Okay, great. Then
I just wanted to follow up, and there were like two interventions that directly addressed what I said. I mean, I was playing an advocatus diaboli. That's quite obvious, and obviously, Hannes, I mean, that's quite clear. We have to differentiate between the EU internal policies, the EU enlargement policy, the foreign policy. But what my bigger point was basically, and you always try to look at the world from your point of view. And if I try to look at the world from the Bosnian point of view, or if I try to look at the world from the point of view of my depressed friends in Serbia, or of one of my best friends from Russia, where I simply lost the contact now since the war started, or when I think about my friends in Budapest or somewhere else, then I see that this kind of imminent loss of value orientation, both within the EU, both within the enlargement policy, but also when it comes to the bigger horizon of the foreign policy of the EU, that has triggered effects that are going to hurten the European continent for years to come. This is the source of my pessimism. I mean, if within the EU now the new rule of law mechanism doesn't deliver results in the case of Hungary, I mean, what's then the next step that we have to take? I think it has to be an open talk whether Hungary can stay as a member state of the European Union, which is then tough. Then you don't have the leverage, etc., etc. But it's I mean, tough decisions that have to be taken. If we have Western Balkans where, like in Serbia, support for Putin is 80% and support for the European Union is 42%, and it went down from 80 10 years or 15 years ago, then this is a disaster. Then it's a disaster that we can't change from today to tomorrow. And this is where I basically, or when we look in Bosnia, 95, end of the war, 27 years of investments, and now we have to deploy new troops basically to keep the peace, then this is the big issue. Obviously, now, I mean, when it comes to Russia, it's the issue of war. But behind the war stands an ideology that is directly confronting what we are. And this is why I think that in all these levels we have to keep up the values, and then obviously, Maciej, I mean, you're totally right. I mean, we have to do the small steps, right? We have to be pragmatic in the implementation of the policies, be wise, not pragmatic, wise, and patient. I mean, that all goes along. That's quite obvious. And just one, I mean, just to throw it in, because Maciej, you were speaking about emotional stamina. Okay, that's important. And I just, as when you mentioned emotional stamina, I just asked myself whether we are self-appeasing ourselves all the time. And then I just looked again at the results of VDEM 2022. Toxic polarization worsening in the year 2011 in 5 countries, in 2021 in 32 countries globally. Countries threatening freedom of expression in 2011, 5 countries, in 2022. Population living in autocracy in 2011, 49%, in 2021, 70%. I don't want to dare to think what could happen if Trump or someone similar could come back to power in the United States. I mean, this is. I think we need to think in dramatic terms in order to be able to be wise and implement small tactical steps internally. That's precisely my point. When I just look at the numbers, I can't be but only basically this advocatus diaboli that I was right now, just for the sake of discussion, but also for the sake of the principle.
But just one comment, the VDEM was not around in 1950s. It wouldn't be that great if it was around during Stalinism in Poland and other countries. Yes, so it's getting worse, and I'm not debating it, but it's maybe that's a normal state. The state when we need to fight for every inch of democracy, maybe that's the normal state. And what was for the brief 2 decades in the 90s, maybe 2000, was an aberration.
Thank you so much. I do not really so much have a question, but maybe also a little bit of a comment when it comes to values and interests. Because we hear that democracies tend not to go to war with each other. This is what we hear, and this is also why it is very important for us that our neighboring countries are more democratic. And this is also, as we know, the enlargement policy is part of it, the Eastern Partnership is also part of it. So this is, and I think, and this is also quite interesting, and this is a pragmatic approach even, it's not really value-based as well. It is our own interest that those countries actually become democracies, so that we would actually live better, more happy, just not being in danger, as what we just saw, what happened when Russia attacked Ukraine these days, which actually most of us didn't even see as a possibility that it is going to happen. A war in Europe. And maybe one more thing, which just because we didn't mention it, and it's so important, especially to Serbia and to Hungary, but also of course to Russia, is is press freedom and freedom of opinion. And we know, I mean, the Serb tabloids, I mean, Victor Orban, how this media imperium, which is more or less owned by the governing party, I mean, those are all the circumstances which actually create this atmosphere in which all this is possible. The same is true for the, sorry to say this, the so-called special operation in Russia. This is only possible because there is no more press freedom or anything. There is no more possibility to assemble in Russia. And this has also been, this has been done in a long time already. What I just want to say is just to give a warning, because we tend to forget about the importance of press freedom, and it starts very, very slowly. It did in Russia. I mean, you could assemble there in the 90s, end of 90s, and Yeltsin. It was possible. You cannot do it right now. The problem is we only see it when it is already too late. And I just think it is very, very important also that we look what is happening in Austria. I mean, you mentioned the problems in Austria. I mean, we still have a free press and whatever, but we also know like how different media outlets are financed by the state, and which ones those are. I mean, this is also already part of it. But just, yeah, very briefly about the role of press freedom and the importance of it.
Yes, I wanted actually, Adi Čeremagić from European Stability Initiative. I wanted just to give a short comment and then to ask you a question. We're talking, sorry. Sorry. We're talking today about, no? Okay, thanks. We're talking about the European Union, but we're forgetting one other institution that exists in Europe, and that's Council of Europe. We had Russia being expelled or being suspended and then leaving on its own. And if we think about European institutional architecture, it's actually Council of Europe that was initially a house of democracies, rule of law, and human rights. EU became a union of human rights and issues quite late in its development. So I think that the example, because that reminded me, Vedran, you were talking about expelling Hungary from the EU, and I'm thinking about the Council of Europe, where we already expelled Russia, and where we can maybe use the energy that was created with that to recapture the institutions, or to liberate the institutions. So the ones that initially were designed for European democracies. That would be the comment from my side. My question would be again similar to our discussions from earlier today, and that is, yes, we need to address authoritarian societies and tendencies, but we at the same time need to show that democracies work, that democracy have the confidence that is necessary. And in that sense, especially in the Western Balkans, I think that we have failed with North Macedonia, we're failing with Kosovo at the moment, and we will probably fail if everything stays the same with Montenegro, if it ever gets a reform government. So I would like to hear from you a comment about that. How are we failing to support democracies or democratic tendencies? This was typical Adi comment.
Okay, so maybe I see there are some hands raising. So, okay, so maybe one more question, and please, the panelists, just remember them, and in your final round of remarks, just address one or two.
Thank you. I will. Maybe it's better this way. Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Tara Tepa's researcher from Belgrade, and I couldn't agree more with a lot of being said, and particularly the fear that we will be losing credibility of Europe in the Western Balkans if we continue putting interest above value. But when we already speak about it, I was having a question also to VEDRAN, but also to everybody else, on how we can also support the citizens in the Western Balkans who are supporting the values of democracy, despite not being able to push for the government who is supporting it. Because if you look at the polls and the results, it's not the majority of citizens who is actually choosing the governments. If we see how many people are getting out of the votes and then how much support they're getting, we cannot say that this is the majority of the population. At the same time, we have seen that there is a lot of citizens who are becoming very active. They are trying to defend the processes, democracy, democratic values and institutions on the streets, but also on the elections, being citizens observers in Hungary, also in Serbia. We have a huge mobilization there. And at the same time, they are sometimes, we can see it, getting disillusioned with Europe. When European Union is supporting some of the leaders in the Western Balkans, despite their lack of support to European Union and the narratives which are very populistic. I'm quite aware that countering these kind of populistic narratives is very hard, especially if Europe is not having a strong voice directly to the citizens. So my question to you is how we can actually support values in enlargement, but also not fail the citizens who are supporting enlargement and keep them directly in connection with Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should conclude here at this point. So I will ask every panelist, unless there were some other questions, no? No. So, okay, I will ask everyone to address all the comments rather shortly, please. Zuzanna, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I will try to tie in a few things, and since I'm Hungarian, I'm also compelled to talk to the point of expelling Hungary. I just cannot leave it like that. So first of all, I really would like to subscribe to the point Stephanie was making about our values are actually being in our interest, among others because of the idea of democratic peace. But indeed, our values are in our long-term interest, and upholding that is in our long-term interest, and I think that is something that we need to try to put through also in countries where value-based, not just foreign policy, value-based policy has pretty much been abandoned, to convey the message to the supporters of these autocratizing forces that on the long run, this will bite back. Now, if we are also talking about the rule of law, I also just want to make the short comment that under the current treaties, it is not possible to expel a country. And when we are arguing for respect for the rule of law, I think we also need to have that in mind and not just throw that in. I totally understand the frustration where this is coming from. I feel that firsthand. But I think we should be a little careful there. And also linking to Tara's point about the citizens supporting European values in the countries of the Western Balkans, but also in Hungary. There is still majority support for EU membership in Hungary, and that is despite having such strong anti-European, Eurosceptic to various degree forces in the country. So on the societal level, there is still support. And I think, although I agree with you that as things stand, if we just work with our current toolkit and follow the current political and institutional strategies, there is no turning back to pre-2010 in Hungary either. I totally agree with that, but we need to tap into those still pro-European forces, maybe with different tools, and find new instruments that can empower and amplify the impact of pro-European forces. Well, currently I would say we don't have many, but we need to invent them. One of the issues in Hungary is really the financial dominance of the governing party across every sector, including the media. We need to build up media outlets that can convey messages that are pro-European and that can reach the society more widely. It's not a 4-year program. It is going to take, I would say, probably decades after all this. But that is what we need to plan with. And we cannot just give up if it doesn't work in the next few years, because it won't. It simply won't. We need to build up a new generation that, in the case of Hungary, is now growing up with the experience that the Prime Minister of Hungary is Victor Orban. And we need to build up a new politician generation that subscribe to the values of the EU. And that needs to get financing, and that is where the EU can come in, the European Commission can come in. And this is not something that we will tackle by the next elections. That's not the time frame that we need to think with.
So I think there are two things. The first one is in order to protect credibility and increase the credibility of the EU and to enforce pro-European movements and people who already support European path of the Western Balkans, we need to see clear actions of the EU. So when it comes to North Macedonia, so to open negotiations, when it comes to Kosovo, visa liberalization, etc. If we don't see clear actions, people will just not trust you. If we did everything you asked from us and we're not getting what you promised us, then we won't believe and we will look for another partner. That is one thing. The second thing is, I think that in regarding the pro-European approach in Western Balkan countries, I think we need to forget about everything what was told to people in the last 20 years and to get a new approach. But that new approach, which would be based on values, but you know, when you go outside of Belgrade and when you speak to people about rule of law, institutions, media freedoms, people just don't care about that. People, they want to see if they have money in their pocket or if they don't have the money. But the more efficient way to get the support for like European Union or European values is to see how those European values will help you to live better. What does it mean, rule of law? Like if you have institutions, there will be like less corruption, you will be able to live better. So to talk more about practical things, what does it mean to live in the European Union? So that we now talk with you and you tell us what does it mean to live in Vienna. And then to have someone from Serbia, for example, outside of Belgrade, some farmer who will talk how he or she sees the life in the European Union, and then to match those two stories, and then to create an approach that would be more understandable to the ordinary people, because we are used to talk about media freedoms, rule of law, institution building, independent institutions. But when you talk to ordinary people, they don't really understand what does it mean for their life.
Vedran, do you want to go next?
4 quick points. I mean, the fact that we do agree about the fact that there is a threat, that there is a problem, the fact that we, to a certain extent, disagree how to approach it, just shows how urgent this whole issue is. I mean, this is now, and this is the moment when we have the agreements and disagreements to start being creative and to start doing. And my 4 points in terms of because I'm utterly an optimist. I mean, when you just start from a very personal level, if you have kids, you just want to have kids being raised up in a free, liberal, democratic society, and not in an authoritarian one. So my first point would be, towards the EU, get your business done. Now, when you have started the rule of law mechanism procedure, go with it. Be consistent. Don't let you be distracted by whom else. I know. When it comes to the Western Balkans, do your business that you started. I mean, if now until the end of the French presidency or until the end of this year, the negotiations are not opened with North Macedonia and Albania, then forget it. Then simply forget it. When it comes to Russia, do your business in terms of sanctions. Do the sanctions on the gas today. I mean, the European Parliament made the decision today. This is going to put an additional pressure. I think this is important, and there are so many sectors where you can and have to do the business that you started and to finish it. Secondly, and this is, I think, one of the most important points, Adi, that you mentioned. I mean, what are democracies about? Democracies are about, yes, values, about joy. I mean, life that you can live happily, freely, etc., etc., while autocracies are fear, control. But democracies are at the same time about institutions that are able to represent people, that are able to deliver, that are accountable, that are fulfilling the promises, etc., expectations of the people. And while the authoritarians or the despots of our times are hollowing out the institutions and making an empty shell of them, I think we need now to think twice how to give a bigger importance to the European Parliament. Go with the Council of Europe right now that Russia is out. I mean, this is the moment of renewal to pick up on the values, to put them to the forefront, to argue, to go out, to put more money into it. The same goes also for the European Commission. I mean, obviously it was a very, very bad joke and very, very bad decision to have the EU Commissioner for Enlargement from Hungary. Don't do these bad jokes in the future. Think twice, etc., etc. This is the second point. The third one, when you spoke about new tools and instruments, I mean, yes, of course, we always need new tools and instruments for whatever we do. I mean, when I come back home, I need new tools and instruments to put my kids to bed because until a certain time they just get used to it. But I mean, the point is, I mean, we have to start working on these new tools. And secondly, we have to take money into our hands and finance the new tools, whatever it is. I mean, and there are certain tools that we can develop. And lastly, and most importantly, there is this kind of ontological question whether human beings are good or bad, capable of loving, cooperating, or hating and killing someone. Now when we see pictures from Bucha, we see this side of which is also a sign of human beings being able to do the utmost evil. On the other hand side, we do see all these brave acts of people standing up, fighting. I mean, we saw the protest movements in Serbia standing up against this Rio Tinto. We saw people in Bosnia going to the streets, even changing the government in North Macedonia. We see people in Hungary engaging, Poland, these huge demonstrations also by women, etc., etc. And I'm co-running a process called Engage Democracy Initiative in the Western Balkans, where we put the activist and local initiatives together, including Samir Beharic, a good friend of us, and many others, basically to show that democracy has to be lived bottom-up through everyday practices on a basic level, defending the rivers, fighting corruption in the local community, etc., etc. And when we assembled them in last September in Belgrade for so-called Engaged Democracy Convention, 120 wonderful young people, all of them optimists, we discussed for 2 days, and guess what? No one mentioned the European Union for a single time. In 2 days, not a single time the European Union was mentioned as a factor. And this is the moment where the EU has to come in. If we take the energies that we have, and if we put and develop proper tools and come back to this kind of a value, live up to the principles, then the people of this Engaged Democracy Initiative in a few years might then start addressing all these issues that are needed bottom up, and at the same time mentioning the EU as a partner and not being, pardon my French, pissed off by the behavior of the last representative of the delegation to Serbia, for example, who just, was, cuddling with Vučić all the time. Or making barbecue with Vučić like Sebastian Kurz did it. So this is the moment where then we can live up to the expectations, where we can develop the joy and have also proper tools to meet them.
Maciej, your concluding remarks, please.
I think we veered towards a very capacious definition of democracy, which makes us both overly depressed and overly confident at the same time. There is an alternative view coming from Przeworski, Schmitter, Lind, Stefan, which basically focus on democracy as a competitive quest for power. And consolidated democracy is when that quest is the only game in town, famous expression. That would allow us not to think about, equate democracy with good governments or with joy or with better politicians. So that would be less ambitious and thereby we would be less depressed. But it will also raise the bar for countries like mine or Serbia or Hungary in a sense that it's not enough to just get, Kaczynski, Orban or Vučić out of power. To really have a consolidated democracy, you need to have a situation in which coming election in Poland, Serbia, or Hungary, it doesn't matter who wins, that institutions are not in question. It's like whether Olaf Scholz wins or whether Armin Laschet wins. Yes, I mean, that's basically the real standard that we should aim at. And that means that those significant, whether it's 50% or 70%, we have significant percentages in those countries of very conservative voters. And unless and until those conservative movements become part of this institutional settlement, of this game in town, in which we all agree that power is fought for at the electoral box, not by stuffing courts with political functionaries or changing media laws. Until then, we can't really say that that our countries are anything more than the Trojan horse of authoritarianism. And I think that's a real challenge that we need to embrace. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe as a concluding remark, I would say that our panel discussion was titled How to Deal with Authoritarianism, and we ended up with saying that we need to strengthen democracy. So maybe that gives us some optimism in the end. At first I thought we had two optimists, Maciej and Vuk, and then two pessimists, VEDRAN and ZSUZANNA, and VEDRAN then said that he was also an optimist. So I think in the end we have to look forward despite everything and do whatever we can. So thank you very much for this discussion and have a nice evening.